So this video will be part of a series that will take a look at human prehistory, in particular through the lens of the video game Dawn of Man by MadrugaWorks. This is a really interesting game that kind of combines city planning and some survival elements, and obviously has kind of a historical theme. So the goal is to kind of take a look at the software to use it to recreate pre-human or pre-literate human societies. And basically take a look at what humankind looked like tens of thousands of years ago. And so that's basically what we'll be taking a look at in the video. This first video we'll take a look at the Paleolithic era. And so what you have here is kind of a neat arrangement of what a Paleolithic village might look like, hypothetically. Obviously, Paleolithic peoples were hunters. Oh, you got a crazy mammoth running through there, right? But basically, Paleolithic people were hunter-gatherers, right? And so they typically were peoples that would follow the herds. In this case, you can see this village, the herds are coming to them, which is very unique that a mammoth just, runs around through there. But maybe that's the mammoth from Ice Age, we don't know. But basically, this is an example of how huts would be laid out. So the peoples here, we'll take a look at how they ate, we'll look at how they hunted, and basically what their lifestyle was like. First of all, these were nomadic peoples. They followed game, as we mentioned before. So they would pack up and move pretty regularly. In the Paleolithic era, you're looking at basically anywhere from 2.5 million years ago to about 10,000 BCE. And these guys were basically, marching around. They would, eat some primitive cereals if they could, berries, that kind of stuff. But mostly they're going to live on a meat diet of animals that they hunt. And so wherever the game goes, that's where they go. So they had to be pretty transitory. The huts, I think, reflect this. You can see they're literally like tents. The tents are usually made of animal hide. They provide some protection. Certainly they're not, like a permanent structure. They're things that can be folded up and moved quickly. And so it's kind of like a camp out site. You notice that within the village itself, they're typically in circles. The reason that we find these hut circles like this is typically for protection purposes. Most of the important buildings, especially food storage, those kinds of things are going to be in the center. The fire, of course, is in the center, and that's going to radiate outwards throughout the entire village, so everybody can get some warmth from it. Also, you have other structures within the village itself. These things over here would refer to as food dryers. So the problem that prehistoric man had was they didn't have refrigerators. The Maytag guy wasn't around yet. So they basically had to find ways to preserve their food. What they would typically do is they would let their food sit out, and then they would basically cook it over a low fire. And what that would do is get rid of all of the moisture that was in that meat. And even though it doesn't make it taste particularly good, getting rid of the moisture allows you to store it. And so food that has essentially been dried out, they create kind of like a jerky of sorts. And then that jerky can ultimately be stored for much longer than you could with an actual steak. And so that's what you see going on here with this food dryers. They're actually drying out the meat so they can preserve it for long periods of time. Another element that you see here are basically what we refer to as skins dryers. These were basically things that they would use to dry out animal skins. After they killed the animal and butchered it, right, they could take the skins, and then if they dried them, right, they could preserve those as well. So they could be used not only to produce new dwellings, they could also use them to make their clothing. Here you can see kind of a summer environment, so they're typically going to be wearing, things made out of leather. But obviously into the fall and the winter, when things get cooler, right, they're going to want furs, right, they're going to want as many skins as possible. And so those kinds of outfits could be created from that as well. So skins were used for a variety of different purposes. The other things you see, of course, within the village itself is the population. You're looking at about 28 to about 30 people in this village. Paleolithic villages typically did not have a lot of people in them. Remember, they're hunter-gatherer societies, so they're, it's going to be slim pickings for some of them. Having 1,000 people in a village is just going to be too hard to feed. It's just too impractical. So most of the time, you're going to have small, clan-style, basically maybe 20, 30 people, if that, maybe more, depending on the village. But in this village in particular, we've got about 28 people as we're about to go to the Mesolithic era. Other aspects of what people did in this era, I would say an important one, of course, is what you see here. We talked about the skins dryers, but this part I think is important to focus on as well. Mr. Dog over here, right? Dogs were an important part of human settlements dating back to the Paleolithic era. They were probably the first animals to be domesticated as far as we know, and their remains have been found next to those of Paleolithic people. Dogs obviously performed some really vital tasks, the most important of which was that they performed security. Dogs would obviously keep many animals at bay. Another thing that dogs would do is they were garbage men, right? They would eat any leftovers. Humans tend to eat the meat and then leave the bones. And of course, as we know about dogs, bones are the best part. That's the part that they like, especially the marrow. So they would basically eat the parts that humans don't. They would eat any scraps that were left over, and that keeps the villages tidy, or as tidy as they could be. Third, obviously, they provide, companionship. Certainly people, would sleep next to their dogs at night. Certainly we believe the dogs could have slept in the huts with the people to keep them warm. And obviously because they're so fuzzy, obviously it could help tremendously. Most of our dogs sleep in our houses even to this day. Some of them even sleep on our beds. So that's a trait that goes back to 10,000 BCE. And then lastly, of course, dogs have fantastic senses. Basically, dogs have the ability to sense things way beyond what a human would. And so whereas humans obviously have a pretty decent sense of sight, but really not much else, dogs obviously have fantastic hearing, great sense of smell. They can sense danger at long distances. And so typically, they could sense, those kinds of things from happening, and they could, alert humans accordingly, which is basically what dogs could do. So I think that pretty much covers most of the major aspects of life in this society. I think probably the next thing to do is to show a hunt. So I'm going to obviously gather some people here, right, to do an actual hunt to show you how that would basically take place. Obviously, humans in this era, their numbers were not really that high. So they had to be very careful about the animals they would hunt. Taking down a full-grown bull, like you see over here, probably wouldn't be the best strategy. So they typically would go after animals that were sick, animals that were smaller. Obviously, a full-grown horse is going to be able to run away pretty quickly. So, wait for the animals, obviously, to drink, like you can see with this mammoth here. And this is a younger mammoth, right? And then, obviously, they could go through and do what they needed to do. And so, obviously, you can see there are spears. In this age, obviously, once the animal has been slain, right, they'll go in, butcher the carcass. And then obviously they'll be able to transport the meat, the bones, those kinds of things back. So yeah, I mean, obviously they could hunt larger animals as it comes to like woolly mammoths and such, but you're going to want a larger tribe for that. You're going to need a lot of people, and typically you'd want to outsmart them. You'd want to run them off a cliff, or wait till they go to drink or something where you can ambush them. And so humans had to be smart because they weren't as physically imposing as other species. So I think that pretty much covers most of the Paleolithic era. In the next video, we'll take a look at the Mesolithic era, and we'll take a look at how this village transforms throughout the timeline.